The gavel banged, signaling the end of the divorce of the century. Richard Harrington stood tall, a smirk playing on his lips. He had won. He kept the company name. He kept the skyscrapers. He kept the billions in visible assets. He looked at his ex-wife, Catherine, expecting tears. Instead, he saw nothing. A ghost of a smile. He didn't know it yet, but he hadn't won an empire. He had won a graveyard. The real power wasn't in the boardrooms he just fought for. It was in the papers he signed 20 years ago without reading. This is the story of how the quiet wife played the long game, and how the loudest man in the room lost everything he thought he owned. The air in the southern district of New York's family court was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and billable hours, specifically $4,000 an hour, which was the combined rate of the legal sharks circling the mahogany tables. Richard Harrington, CEO of Harrington Global and the face of modern American logistics, checked his Patek Philippe watch. It was a reflex, a show of dominance. He wanted everyone in the room, the judge, the press in the back row, and especially the woman sitting at the opposite table, to know that his time was more valuable than their justice. "Mr. Harrington," Judge O'Malley said, peering over his spectacles, "you understand the terms of this decree? By signing this, you are effectively severing all marital ties with Mrs. Harrington. The division of assets, as stipulated by the prenuptial agreement and the subsequent Harrington Accord of 2018, will be final." Richard smoothed the lapel of his charcoal Brioni suit. He glanced at his lawyer, a man named Arthur Penhaligon from the firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mega, and Flom. One of the few real names that struck fear into Wall Street hearts. Arthur gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "It's done. We crushed her." "I understand completely, Your Honor," Richard said, his voice a practiced baritone that had charmed investors from Tokyo to Davos. He looked across the aisle. Catherine Harrington, soon to be Catherine Sinclair again, sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She wore a cream-colored suit that whispered, "Old money," rather than shouted it. No jewelry, no makeup to hide the fine lines around her eyes. She looked tired, Richard thought. Defeated. For 20 years, she had been the silent fixture at his side. The woman who organized the charity galas, raised their 2 sons, and nodded politely while he explained the intricacies of global supply chains to dignitaries who already knew them. She was the background noise to his symphony, and now she was being faded out. "Mrs. Harrington?" the judge asked. Catherine looked up. Her eyes were a piercing, clear grey. "I understand, Your Honor. I am ready to sign." Richard suppressed a scoff. Of course she was ready. She was walking away with the Hamptons estate, a lump sum of $50 million, and her dignity. It was a pittance compared to what he was keeping: the brand, the intellectual property, the fleet of ships, the warehouses, and the control of Harrington Global, a company valued at $12 billion. He had fought tooth and nail for the company, painting her as a disinterested housewife who wouldn't know a balance sheet from a brunch menu. The pens scratched across the paper. The sound was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Scratch, scratch. Done. The gavel banged. Divorce granted. Richard stood up immediately. He felt lighter, as if a physical weight had been unbuckled from his chest. He turned to Catherine, extending a hand, a gesture of magnanimous victory. "No hard feelings, Kate," he said, flashing the smile that had graced the cover of Forbes. "You're taken care of. The boys will be fine. Let's keep this civil for the press outside." Catherine looked at his hand, then up at his face. She didn't take it. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. He retracted his hand, annoyed but undeterred. He turned and strode out of the courtroom, the double doors bursting open to a wall of camera flashes. "Mr. Harrington! Mr. Harrington! Is it true you retained 90% of the voting stock?" A reporter from the Wall Street Journal shouted, "Mr. Harrington, is Isabella Morel moving into the Fifth Avenue penthouse tonight?" A distinctively trashier tabloid reporter yelled. Richard stopped on the courthouse steps, putting on his sunglasses. Isabella Morel. The name sent a thrill through him. She was 26, a brilliant PR strategist, and the woman who made him feel like a titan, not just a husband. She was waiting in the black Maybach at the curb. "Harrington Global remains under my firm leadership," Richard announced to the cameras, his voice cutting through the noise. "This was a necessary restructuring of my personal life to ensure the company's future is as streamlined and aggressive as our business model. Thank you." He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the questions about Catherine. Who cared about Catherine? She was history. He slid into the back seat of the Maybach. Isabella was there, scrolling on her phone. She looked up, her eyes bright. "Well?" she asked. "It's over," Richard said, loosening his tie. "I got it all. The company, the brand, the fleet. She took the cash and the beach house. It was easier than I thought." Isabella laughed, leaning over to kiss him. "I told you, she didn't have the stomach for a fight. She's a housewife, Rick. You're a shark." "Drive," Richard told the driver. "The Four Seasons. We're celebrating." As the car pulled away, Richard looked out the rear window. He saw Catherine emerging from the courthouse, alone. She didn't stop for the cameras. She simply walked down the steps, turned left, and disappeared into the New York crowd. He felt a fleeting moment of pity. "Poor Kate," he thought. "She has no idea how cold the real world is without me." He turned back to Isabella, who was already opening a bottle of Dom Perignon. He had won the war. He was the king of New York. He had no idea that the housewife he just dismissed had just handed him a grenade with the pin pulled out. The celebration lasted 3 days. It was a whirlwind of champagne, high-end sushi, and a quick trip to Miami on the company jet. Richard felt invincible. The stock price of Harrington Global had actually ticked up on the news of the divorce finalization. The market loved stability, and Richard Harrington was the definition of a stable, iron-fisted leader. On Monday morning, reality, or what Richard assumed was reality, resumed. He walked into the Harrington Global headquarters in Lower Manhattan. The building was a glass needle piercing the sky, a testament to his ego. He nodded to the security guards, who saluted him. He took the private elevator to the 40th floor. When the doors opened, the atmosphere was different. Usually the executive floor was buzzing with terrified assistants and eager VPs. Today it was quiet. Too quiet. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," his executive assistant, Sarah, said. She didn't look up from her screen. Her voice lacked its usual chirpy deference. "Sarah, get me the Q3 projections and get legal on the line. I want to make sure the title transfer for the chaotic assets is clear," Richard barked as he breezed past her desk toward his office. "Mr. Harrington," Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in the boardroom." Richard stopped, his hand on his office doorknob. "Blackwood? Why is the CFO in the boardroom? We don't have a board meeting until next month." "He said it was urgent, sir." Richard frowned. James Blackwood had been with the company for 30 years. He was a dinosaur, a man of ledgers and frowns, but he was loyal, or so Richard thought. Fine. Richard turned and marched into the boardroom. The room was expansive, with a view of the Statue of Liberty. At the head of the table sat James Blackwood. Next to him was a woman Richard didn't recognize, a severe-looking woman in a navy suit with a briefcase that looked more expensive than Richard's car. "James," Richard said, throwing his jacket onto a chair. "What is this? I have a lunch at Le Bernardin at noon." "Sit down, Richard," James said. His voice was flat. Richard bristled. "Excuse me? I'm the CEO of this company. I don't sit down when my CFO tells me to." "You are the CEO of Horrington Global Operating Corp," the woman said. Her accent was British, crisp and clipped. "I am Eleanor Sterling, representing the trustee." Richard squinted at her. "What trustee?" "I just divorced the only person who could possibly have a claim, and she's gone. The trust structures were dissolved or transferred to me." "Not all of them," Eleanor said. She slid a thick binder across the polished table. "You might want to read the Sinclair Master Lease Agreement of 2004. Specifically, Clause 14, Section B." Richard laughed, a cold, nervous sound. 2004. That's ancient history. That was when Kate's father died and left us the seed money to expand into Asia. I signed 1,000 papers back then. It was a formality. "It was a structure," James Blackwood said, finally looking Richard in the eye. "Catherine's father, Lord Sinclair, didn't trust you, Richard. He never did. He didn't leave the money to you. He didn't even leave it to the company." "He left it to a holding company," Eleanor interjected. "Sinclair Holdings, registered in the Cook Islands for asset protection. Sinclair Holdings owns the ships. It owns the warehouses. It owns the proprietary logistics software code. It even owns the trademark Harrington Global." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. "That's absurd. I built this brand. I've been running it for 2 decades. The courts just awarded me the company." "The court awarded you the operating company," Eleanor corrected gently, as if speaking to a slow child. "You own the entity that manages the day-to-day business. You own the contracts with the clients. You own the liabilities. You own the payroll." "But," James continued, "the operating company leases every single asset it uses from Sinclair Holdings. The ships? Leased. The office we are standing in? Leased. The brand name? Licensed." Richard slammed his hands on the table. "So what? It's a paper shuffle. It's been that way for years. We just pay the lease and keep moving." "The leases were on 20-year terms," Eleanor said. She tapped the binder. "They expired yesterday, at midnight." The silence in the room was deafening. The hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. "Expired?" Richard whispered. "Yes," James said. "And Sinclair Holdings has decided not to renew." "Who?" Richard's throat was dry. "Who controls Sinclair Holdings?" James didn't answer. He just looked out the window. Eleanor opened her briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "The beneficiary of the Sinclair Trust has appointed a new board of directors for the holding company. They have issued a notice to vacate and cease desist. You have 48 hours to remove the Harrington branding from all assets, vacate the premises, and return the ships to port." "Who is the beneficiary?" Richard roared. "Is it the kids? Is it some bank in Zurich?" The door to the boardroom opened. Richard spun around. Catherine stood there. She wasn't wearing the defeated beige suit from the courtroom. She was wearing a sharp, tailored black dress by Dior. She wore a necklace of sapphires he had never seen before. Sinclair sapphires. She looked taller. She walked into the room, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots. She didn't look at James. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked straight at Richard. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was cool, stripped of the warmth he had taken for granted for 20 years. "Kate?" Richard stammered. "What are you doing here? You signed the papers. You took the 50 million. "I took the settlement for the marital assets," Catherine said, walking to the head of the table. James Blackwood immediately stood up and pulled out the chair for her. She sat down in the seat Richard usually occupied. "The Sinclair Trust was never a marital asset," she said calmly. "It was an inheritance, protected by the ironclad laws of the Cook Islands and managed by a board I appointed 3 months ago. You never asked about the holding company, Richard. You were too busy fighting for the stock of the operating arm. You were so desperate to be the captain of the ship, you didn't notice you don't own the boat." Richard stared at her. His brain was misfiring. This was the woman who baked muffins. This was the woman who asked him how to reset the Wi-Fi router. You can't do this," he sputtered. "If you pull the assets, the operating company collapses. The stock goes to zero. I lose everything." Catherine leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. A small, dangerous smile played on her lips. "Correction, Richard," she said. "You lose everything. I simply take my ships back and lease them to a competent operator. I've already been in talks with Maersk. They're very interested in our Pacific routes." "You're bluffing?" Richard said, though his voice wavered. "You love this company. You built it with me." "I built it for us," she said. "But you destroyed us. You thought you could trade me in for a newer model and keep the empire I financed? You thought I was just the furniture?" She stood up. "You have 48 hours, Richard. Get out of my building." She turned to James. "Mr. Blackwood, please have security escort Mr. Harrington to his office to collect his personal effects. Ensure he takes nothing proprietary." "Yes, ma'am," James said. Richard stood frozen as Catherine walked out of the room, flanked by her lawyer. He watched the door close. He looked at the view of the Statue of Liberty. It was the same view he had looked at yesterday. But yesterday, he was a billionaire. Today, he was a man standing in a rented room, wearing a suit he suddenly wasn't sure he could afford to dry clean. The war hadn't ended in the courtroom. It had just begun. Richard Harrington did not pack a box. He did not call security. Instead, he barricaded himself in the executive suite on the 40th floor, turning the office into a war room. "Get Arthur back on the phone," Richard screamed, hurling a crystal tumbler of scotch against the wall. It shattered, leaving a wet, amber stain on the silk wallpaper. Wallpaper that, as of midnight last night, technically belonged to his ex-wife. Isabella Morel sat on the leather sofa, her face pale. The glow of her tablet illuminated her terror. She was a PR genius, a master of spin, but there was no spinning this. "Richard, Twitter is already trending. Someone leaked the board meeting. They're calling it the Red Wedding of Wall Street." "Harrington over is trending. I don't care about hashtags," Richard roared. He loosened his tie, looking manic. "I care about leverage. Arthur, where are we?" Arthur Penhaligon, the exorbitantly expensive lawyer who had assured Richard the divorce was a slam dunk, was currently sweating through his custom shirt. He had 3 paralegals on speakerphone, frantically scouring the digital archives. "Richard, it's tight," Arthur admitted, his voice losing its usual smooth cadence. "The Sinclair master lease is ironclad. It was drafted by Sullivan and Cromwell back in the 90s, but we have one card left to play." "Play it," Richard snapped. "The client contracts," Arthur said. "You own the operating company. That means you own the relationships. The ships are useless if they don't have cargo. The warehouses are just empty boxes if no one pays to store goods in them. Catherine has the hardware, but we have the software. We have the revenue stream." Richard's eyes lit up. He slammed his hand on the desk. "Exactly. She thinks she can starve me out? I'll starve her. I control the flow of goods for 40% of the East Coast retail market. If I move my contracts to a competitor, if I subcontract the logistics to Maersk or DHL, Her ships sit empty. She'll hemorrhage millions a day in maintenance fees. He grabbed his phone. I'm calling Mason Kincaid at Apex Retail. They're 30% of our volume. If I tell Mason that Catherine is holding his holiday shipments hostage in a divorce spat, he'll sue her into oblivion. Isabella stood up, finding her footing. I can work with that. The mad housewife stalling the supply chain. We paint her as emotional, unstable. We say she's risking Christmas to get back at her ex-husband. Do it, Richard commanded. Draft the press release. I'm calling Mason. Richard dialed the private number of the CEO of Apex Retail, the largest big-box store chain in America. Usually, Mason answered on the second ring. Today, it went to voicemail. Richard dialed again. Voicemail. Try the office line, Arthur suggested. Richard dialed the executive assistant. This is Richard Harrington. Put Mason on. It's an emergency. One moment, Mr. Harrington. The hold music played. It was Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Richard paced the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. Winter is coming, he thought bitterly. Finally, the line clicked. But it wasn't Mason Kincaid. Richard, a cool, unfamiliar voice answered. This is David Sterling, General Counsel for Apex Retail. Richard froze. I don't want legal, David. I want Mason. We have a situation with the logistics fleet. We know, David said. His tone was clipped, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. We received a notification from Sinclair Holdings this morning regarding the termination of your lease on the transport vessels. That's a temporary dispute, Richard lied smoothly. Catherine is being difficult. But I hold your contract. I guarantee the shipments. I'm going to subcontract your load to another carrier until I resolve this. You can't do that, Richard, David said. Excuse me? Read the contract. I have the right to subcontract in force majeure events. This isn't force majeure, David replied, and you might want to look at Clause 18, Section C of our service agreement, the change of control and key asset provision. Richard felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. What about it? The contract stipulates that Harrington Global Operating Corp. Must maintain direct control of the primary logistics fleet. Failure to maintain the lease on the Sinclair vessels constitutes a material breach of contract. Furthermore, the contract automatically terminates if the Harrington brand usage rights are lost. Richard stopped breathing. We terminated the contract at 9:08 a.m., Richard, David continued. We've already signed a new direct service agreement with the asset holder. You signed with Catherine, Richard whispered. We signed with Sinclair Logistics, David corrected. They offered us a 5% discount for cutting out the middleman being you, Richard. We appreciate your years of service, but business is business. The line went dead. Richard dropped the phone. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. Richard? Isabella asked, stepping closer. What did they say? Richard looked up, his eyes hollow. She didn't just take the ships, he rasped. She took the clients. She went behind my back and offered them a deal to cut me out. That's tortious interference, Arthur shouted, finally finding a legal angle. We can sue her for stealing clients. With what money? Richard laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. Without the Apex contract, our revenue drops by 30%. Without the revenue, we can't service the debt on the operating company. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed. It was Sarah, his assistant, outside. Her voice was trembling. Mr. Harrington, there are people here to see you. I told you no press, Richard shouted. It's not the press, sir, Sarah said. It's the bank. It's Mr. Gantry from Goldman. Richard slumped into his chair. The vultures weren't circling anymore. They had landed. While Richard was watching his world dismantle itself from the 40th floor, Catherine Sinclair was sitting in a quiet, sun-drenched library at the St. Regis Hotel, 10 blocks away. The room smelled of old paper and fresh lilies. On the table in front of her wasn't a panic-stricken mess of legal pads, but a neat arrangement of tea, scones, and 3 tablets displaying live data feeds of global shipping lanes. Sitting opposite her were 3 men and 1 woman. To the outside world, they were retired executives, people who had aged out of the game. To Catherine, they were the shadow board. "Apex is secure," said the man on the left. This was Tobias Vance, a former logistics titan whom Richard had ruthlessly hostile takeovered 10 years ago. Richard had forced Tobias into early retirement, humiliating him. Catherine had found him 6 months ago, bored and hungry for revenge. Mason Kincaid was happy to sign. He never liked Richard's arrogance, anyway. The rebranding crews are standing by at the docks in Newark, Savannah and Long Beach, said the woman, Elena Rossetti. She was a marketing genius Richard had fired because she was too old at 45. As soon as the clock strikes the 48-hour mark, the Harrington decals get painted over. We're going with Sinclair Horizon, blue and silver. "And the banks?" Catherine asked, taking a sip of Earl Grey tea. "That was the easiest part," said the third man, an elderly gentleman with a cane. He was Silas Thorne. No, not Thorne. He was Silas Sterling, Eleanor's father, and a man whose family bank had financed Richard's initial expansion. Richard had refinanced away from them the moment he got a better rate, insulting the family honor. I called Lawrence Gantry at Goldman. I pointed out that Richard's operating loans were secured by future revenue, dependent on assets he no longer controls. Gantry panicked. "He's calling the loans in today." Catherine nodded slowly. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel the manic highs that Richard thrived on. She felt the cold, precise satisfaction of an equation balancing out. "He never read the papers," Catherine said softly, almost to herself. "For 20 years, I put the documents in front of him. I told him, 'Richard, this is for the trust. Richard, this is for the asset protection.' He just signed. He thought because I was changing diapers and hosting dinner parties, I wasn't paying attention. He thought you were an accessory," Tobias growled. "He forgot you were the engine." "What about the mistress?" Elena asked. "Isabella Morel." Catherine's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop a degree. "Isabella is a pragmatist," Catherine said. "She's attracted to power. When the power evaporates, so will she. I give it 6 hours." Her phone buzzed. It was a text from James Blackwood, who was still inside the headquarters, acting as her eyes and ears. Text: "He's trying to transfer the employee pension fund to a new LLC to protect it from the creditors. He's going to embezzle the pension to pay his legal fees." Catherine's eyes hardened. This was it. The line. Richard was greedy, yes. He was unfaithful, yes. But stealing from the employees, the people who had worked for them for decades, that was a new low. "He's crossing the line," Catherine told the group. "He's going after the pension fund." Tobias sat up straighter. "If he touches that, he goes to prison. Not federal resort prison. Real prison. We have to stop him," Catherine said. She stood up. "The 48 hours aren't up, but I'm not waiting for him to loot the burning building." "What are you going to do?" Silas asked. Catherine picked up her purse. "I'm going back to the office, and I'm bringing the police." "On what grounds?" "Embezzlement," Catherine said. "I have access to his emails. I've had access for 6 months. I know his passwords because he uses his birthday. His birthday, not the kids', not mine. His." She walked to the door. "Eleanor, call the district attorney." Tell him we have evidence of attempted wire fraud and fiduciary breach. Meet me at the tower." Back at the Harrington Tower, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. Richard was typing furiously on his laptop. "I just need to move the liquidity," he shouted at Arthur. "If I move the $20 million from the pension account to the Cayman shell, I can pay off the initial margin call from Goldman. It buys us a week." "Richard, that is highly illegal," Arthur warned, backing away. "That is ERISA fraud. I cannot be a party to this." "Then get out!" Richard screamed. "I'll do it myself." Isabella was standing by the window, looking down at the street. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, "there are police cars downstairs. A lot of them. They're here for traffic control." Richard dismissed her, hitting Enter on the transfer. The screen spun. "Processing." "Richard," Isabella said, turning around. She had her purse over her shoulder. "I'm leaving." "What?" "No, you're not. We have a dinner with the investors in Tokyo via Zoom in an hour." "There are no investors, Richard," Isabella snapped. The mask of adoration finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "It's over. You're broke. You're about to be sued by everyone from your wife to the SEC. I'm not going down with you. I have a reputation." "I made you," Richard snarled, standing up. "You were nothing but a junior publicist until I picked you." "And you are nothing but a signature on a check," Isabella retorted, and the check bounced. She opened the door to leave, but stopped. Standing in the doorway was Catherine. Behind her were 2 NYPD detectives and a very grim-looking man from the district attorney's office. Isabella froze. She looked at Catherine, then down at the floor. "I was just leaving, Mrs. Harrington." "Goodbye, Isabella," Catherine said, not even looking at the girl. Her eyes were locked on Richard. Richard stood behind his desk, the laptop screen still glowing behind him. Transfer failed. Authorization denied by trustee. He looked at the screen, then at Catherine. "You blocked it," he whispered. "James Blackwood has override authority on all accounts over $10,000, Catherine said, stepping into the office. "Did you forget that too? You promoted him to CFO, Richard." I can explain," Richard stammered, looking at the detectives. "This is a misunderstanding. A corporate restructuring." "Mr. Harrington," one of the detectives said, stepping forward with handcuffs rattling on his belt. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the attempted theft of the Harrington Global Employee Pension Fund and securities fraud." Richard looked at the handcuffs. He looked at the luxury office he had designed. He looked at the view of the city he thought he owned. Then he looked at his wife. Really looked at her, for the first time in years. He saw the intelligence, the resolve, the power. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why destroy it all? Why burn the house down?" Catherine stepped close enough that only he could hear her. "I didn't burn the house down, Richard," she whispered. "I just evicted the squatter." The detective grabbed Richard's wrist. "Richard Harrington, you are under arrest." As they marched him out, past his weeping secretary, past the shocked staff, and into the waiting elevator, Richard didn't look like a titan of industry. He looked small. The elevator doors closed. Catherine stood alone in the executive office. It was silent. James Blackwood walked in a moment later. "The transfer was blocked. The funds are safe." "Good," Catherine said. She walked over to the desk, Richard's desk, and picked up the nameplate that read, "Richard Harrington, CEO." She dropped it into the trash can. "Call maintenance," she said. "I want this office repainted. I hate this color." "What color would you like, Mrs. Sinclair?" James asked. Catherine looked out at the horizon, where one of her ships was just visible in the harbor, turning its bow toward the open sea. "Blue," she said, Sinclair blew. Richard Harrington made bail at 3:00 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday. The humiliation was total. His shoelaces had been taken, his tie removed, and his mugshot was already circulating on TMZ with the headline, "Logistics Kingpin, more like logistics pauper." He walked out of the precinct to a lone black sedan. It wasn't the Maybach, it was an Uber Black. He retreated to the only place he had left, a junior suite at a boutique hotel in Soho that he had used for affairs in the past. It was anonymous, paid for in cash, and far away from the prying eyes of the Upper East Side. Inside, Richard didn't sleep. He paced. The rage that had consumed him in the office had calcified into a cold, hard determination. Catherine thought she had won because she held the ships. She was wrong. She had the hardware, but he had the narrative. He grabbed his burner phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Gary," Richard said when the line connected. "It's Richard. I need a slot on the show. Tomorrow." Gary Vancroft was the host of The Titan's Den, a podcast with 20 million listeners, mostly angry young men who worshipped captains of industry. Gary owed Richard a favor for an insider stock tip back in 19. "Richard, you're radioactive right now, man," Gary said. "The embezzlement charges are fabricated," Richard cut in smoothly. "It's a corporate coup, Gary. A hostile takeover disguised as a divorce. The world thinks I'm the villain? Let me tell them the truth. Let me tell them how a vindictive ex-wife is destroying an American legacy just to settle a score." Gary paused. The ratings would be astronomical. 8 NAM. Don't be late. By noon the next day, the narrative had shifted. Richard's performance on the podcast was masterful. He cried just a single, manly tear about building a company for his sons, only to have it stripped away by a woman who never spent a day on the loading dock. He painted Catherine not as a victim, but as a bored socialite playing with people's livelihoods. The stock of Harrington Global, now trading wildly as analysts tried to figure out who owned what, tanked 15%. Inside the newly painted Sinclair Blue offices, the mood was tense. "The board of the operating company is revolting," James Blackwood said, putting down his phone. "They're calling for an emergency general meeting. They want to reinstate Richard as a consultant to stabilize investor confidence. They don't believe you can run the logistics, Catherine." Catherine stood by the window, watching the rain. "They think I'm a gardener who inherited a Ferrari," she murmured. "Basically," James admitted. "The meeting is set for Friday at the Waldorf Astoria. The heavy hitters will be there. Vanguard, BlackRock, the State Street reps. If you can't convince them you know how to steer the ship, they'll force a sale of the operating company. And if they sell it to a private equity firm friendly to Richard, he could be back in charge by Monday." Catherine turned around. Her eyes were flinty. "Get me the manifest for the Atlantic Titan." "The container ship. It's currently docked in Rotterdam." "Why?" "Because," Catherine said, walking to her desk. "Richard always ignored the Rotterdam route. He said it was low margin. He didn't know that for the past 3 years, I've been using that route to pilot a fully automated logistics protocol with Tesla's European division. I haven't just been baking muffins, James. I've been modernizing the fleet behind his back." She picked up her tablet. "Set up the meeting. And tell the chef at the Waldorf to prepare the sea bass. It's Richard's favorite. I want him to smell it while he watches me eat him alive." The ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria was filled with men in grey suits. The air smelled of expensive cologne and skepticism. Richard was there, sitting in the back row with Arthur Penhaligon. Technically, he was barred from company premises, but as a major shareholder, he still held 15% of the voting stock personally. He had a right to be at the general meeting. He looked rested, smug. He had the room on his side. When Catherine took the stage, the applause was polite but tepid. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice amplified clearly through the room. "You are worried. You see the stock price falling. You hear the rumors started by my former husband." She gestured to Richard in the back. Heads turned. Richard gave a small, arrogant wave. "You believe that Harrington Global needs Richard Harrington to survive," Catherine continued, "because he is the visionary, because he is the face." "He built the roads," a heckler shouted from the middle row, one of Richard's cronies. "No," Catherine said sharply. "He drove the truck, and for the last 5 years, he's been driving it drunk." A gasp rippled through the room. Catherine clicked a remote. The giant screen behind her lit up. It wasn't a PowerPoint of buzzwords. It was a forensic accounting of the company's efficiency ratings. Under Richard's leadership, our on-time in full delivery rate dropped from 98% to 84%, Catherine stated, the laser pointer dancing on the red line. Why? Because he insisted on using substandard fuel to skim bonuses for the executive suite. He routed ships through high-risk zones to save on insurance premiums, resulting in 3 seizures by pirates in the Malacca Strait, incidents he paid to hush up. Richard shifted in his seat. This wasn't the emotional ex-wife speech he expected. This was data. Furthermore, Catherine continued, Richard claims I know nothing of logistics. Yet, while he was golfing in Scotland last year, I negotiated the Sinclair Protocol. She clicked the remote again. The logo of Amazon Web Services and Tesla appeared on screen next to the Sinclair logo. For 3 years, Sinclair Holdings has been the silent beta tester for the world's first AI-driven autonomous shipping lane. We have reduced fuel consumption by 20% and transit time by 14%. A murmur of genuine interest went through the institutional investors. BlackRock's representative leaned forward. "I have a signed contract here," Catherine said, holding up a document, "from Amazon Europe. They are switching their entire transatlantic bulk transport to us, effective immediately. But there is a condition." She paused for effect. "The condition is that the operating company must be solvent, transparent, and absolutely severed from the management style of the previous regime. If Richard Harrington remains associated with this company in any capacity, consultant, board member, or figurehead, the contract is void." She looked directly at the BlackRock rep. "So, the choice is yours. You can have the titan who lost you 15% this week and embezzled the pension fund. Or you can have the future of logistics, backed by the strongest contract in the Atlantic. You cannot have both." Silence descended on the ballroom. It was heavy, judgmental silence. Then the BlackRock representative stood up. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at Catherine. "I move to strip Richard Harrington of all voting rights due to conduct detrimental to the company," he said. "Seconded," said the Vanguard rep immediately. "All in favor?" the chairman of the board asked. A sea of hands went up. Richard stood up, his face purple. "You can't do this. I founded this company. I am Harrington Global." "Sit down, Mr. Harrington," the chairman said coldly, "or security will remove you." Richard looked around. The men who had slapped his back on the golf course were looking at their shoes. The podcast fans weren't here. The Twitter trolls weren't here. Here, money talked, and Catherine had just put billions on the table. He stormed out, the heavy doors closing behind him with a finality that felt like a coffin lid slamming shut. Catherine didn't watch him go. She was already answering a question about the AI integration protocols. She had won the room. Richard was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a man who escalated. Stripped of his company, his reputation, and his access to the corporate coffers, He was now running on pure adrenaline and spite. He had one card left: mutually assured destruction. He sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the curtains drawn against the midday sun. Opposite him sat a man who went by the name Kozlov. Kozlov wasn't a lawyer or a PR agent. He was a digital excavator. He found dirt where there was none. "She's clean, Richard," Kozlov said, his voice gravelly, accented with something Eastern European. "I've gone through her emails, her bank accounts, her phone records for 10 years. She donates to dog shelters. She pays her taxes early. She calls her mother every Sunday. It's disgusting." "No one is that clean," Richard snapped, pacing the small room. "She's hiding something. The Sinclair Trust. Look there. The money had to come from somewhere. Her father, Lord Sinclair, was an old British imperialist. There has to be blood money. Illegal arms dealing. Tax evasion. Something I can leak to the feds to freeze her assets." Kozlov sighed and tapped on his ruggedized laptop. "I tried the trust. It's a fortress, encrypted with military-grade keys, but what?" Richard leaned in, hungry. "There is a server," Kozlov said slowly. "An offline server. It's physically located in the basement of the Hamptons house, the house she got in the divorce. It's not connected to the cloud. That's where the sensitive family archives are." "The Hamptons house," Richard mused. He knew the house. He had bought it. No, wait. She had inherited it. He had just spent weekends there complaining about the sand. "If there's a smoking gun," Kozlov said, "it's on that server, but I can't hack it remotely. I need physical access." Richard stared at the wall. A plan formed. It was insane. It was criminal. But he was already facing charges. What was one more risk if it meant exoneration and victory? "I still have a key," Richard whispered. She changed the locks on the apartment, but she never changed the locks on the beach house. She's sentimental. "Richard, that's breaking and entering," Kozlov warned. "It's my house," Richard shouted, deluding himself. "I paid for the renovations. I'm going in." It was a moonless night when Richard parked his rental car a mile down the beach. He walked along the dunes, the salt spray stinging his face. He wore black, feeling ridiculous, like a cat burglar in a bad movie. The house loomed dark against the sky. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion, shingled and weathered. He crept up to the back door, his heart hammering. He tried the key he had kept on his keychain for years. It turned. Click. He almost laughed. "Sentimental fool," he thought. "You left the door open for me." He slipped inside. The house smelled of lavender and wood smoke. He used his phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam across the familiar hallway. He headed straight for the basement door. He descended the stairs, the wood creaking under his Italian loafers. In the corner of the wine cellar, behind a rack of vintage Bordeaux, was the server rack. It was humming softly. "Got you," Richard hissed. He pulled a USB drive from his pocket. Kozlov had loaded it with an extraction program. He plugged it into the console. The screen flickered to life. A password prompt appeared. Richard paused. He tried Catherine's birthday. Access denied. He tried their anniversary. Access denied. He tried the name of their first dog. Access denied. He sweated. What would she use? What was the one thing that mattered to her? He thought back to the courtroom, the Sinclair Accord of 2018. He typed, "Sinclair 2018. Access denied." He was locked out. Desperate, he looked around the desk. Maybe she wrote it down. No, she was too smart for that. Then a text appeared on the screen. Not a system prompt. A message? "Hello, Richard." Richard jumped back, dropping the phone. He scrambled to pick it up. The text on the screen continued typing itself. "I knew you kept the key. I never changed the locks because I knew you'd come back here when you ran out of options." "What is this?" Richard whispered. looking around for a camera. "You're looking for dirt, aren't you?" The screen typed. "You want to know where the money came from. You want to find the skeletons. Press enter to view the files." Richard's hand trembled. Was it a trap, or was she taunting him? He reached out and hit enter. A folder opened. It was labeled The Harrington Liability. Richard clicked it. Hundreds of files flooded the screen. Scans of checks, PDFs of emails, audio recordings. He opened one at random. It was a scan of a wire transfer from 2015. 500,000 to a shell company in Panama. He recognized it. It was a bribe he had paid to a customs official in Brazil to release a shipment of electronics. He opened another. An email thread where he instructed his former CFO to falsify the quarterly earnings report to boost the stock price before he sold his options. He opened a third. Photos of him with Isabella Morel on a yacht in the Mediterranean, dated 3 years ago, paid for with company funds, listed as client development. Richard stared at the screen, horror dawning on him. This wasn't her dirt, it was his. The text on the screen resumed. "I didn't collect this to blackmail you, Richard. I collected it to save the company when you eventually imploded. I knew you were reckless. I knew you were corrupt. So I kept the receipts. All of them. For 20 years. And now you've broken into a private residence to access them, which means you've just committed felony burglary to steal evidence of your own previous crimes. Smile for the camera." A bright light flashed from the corner of the room. A red LED blinked on a hidden lens. Sirens wailed in the distance. Not the distant city sirens, but close, piercing wails coming up the driveway. Richard slumped against the wine rack. He looked at the USB drive still sticking out of the computer. He had walked right into the spider's web. He heard the front door burst open. "Police! Downstairs! Go! Go!" Richard didn't run. He just sat there, bathed in the blue light of the monitor, scrolling through the encyclopedia of his own greed. When the officers came down the stairs, guns drawn, they found Richard Harrington laughing. It was a broken, wheezing laugh. "She wins," Richard said to the confused officers. "She always wins." 1 year later, the Federal Correctional Institution at Otisville was a stark contrast to the boardrooms Richard Harrington used to command. There was no mahogany, no plush carpet, only concrete, steel, and the smell of industrial cleaner. Richard sat in the visitation room. He had lost 20 pounds. His hair, once dyed a rich chestnut, was now fully grey. He wore a beige jumpsuit that fit poorly. The door buzzed, and Catherine walked in. She looked radiant. Not in a flashy, "look at me" way, but in a way that suggested deep, unshakable peace. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a small leather portfolio. She sat down opposite him, the plexiglass barrier the only thing separating their worlds. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was kind, which hurt him more than if she had screamed. "Kate," Richard croaked. He cleared his throat. "You didn't have to come." "I know," she said. "But the boys wanted me to give you this." She slid a photo against the glass. It was a picture of their 2 sons, William and Edward, standing on the deck of a massive container ship. The hull was painted a deep, brilliant blue. The name on the side read, "The Catherine." "They're working?" Richard asked, squinting at the photo. "Deckhands," Catherine said. They started at the bottom. Edward is scrubbing decks. William is learning navigation. They aren't vice presidents. They aren't heirs waiting for a payout. They are learning the business the way my father wanted you to learn it. Richard looked away. "I built that company to give them everything." "You built that company to give yourself everything," Catherine corrected gently. "You gave them a legacy of debt and arrogance. I'm giving them a work ethic." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up, a flicker of his old sharpness returning. "There's one thing I still don't understand," he said. "Kozlov. The hacker. I paid him $50,000 to find that server. How did he know about the beach house basement? You never told anyone about the offline archive, not even me." Catherine smiled. It was a sad smile. "Richard, you didn't hire Kozlov." Richard frowned. "Of course I did. I found him on the dark web." "You found a contact on a forum that James Blackwood monitors," Catherine said. "Kozlov doesn't exist. The man you met in the hotel room? That was an actor we hired, a former forensic accountant who needed a job." Richard's jaw dropped. You set me up?" "I gave you a choice," Catherine said firmly. "If you had walked away, if you had accepted the loss and moved on with your life, you would be a free man today. You would be in the Hamptons, complaining about the sand. But I knew you wouldn't stop. I knew you would burn the company to the ground rather than let me run it. So I had to give you a target. I had to let you destroy yourself." She leaned in closer to the glass. "You thought you were breaking into my house to find my sins, but you were breaking in to sign your own confession. You handed the district attorney the evidence on a silver platter because your ego couldn't conceive that the trap was set for you. Not by you." Richard sat back, the breath leaving him. He had been playing checkers. She hadn't just been playing chess, she had designed the board. "You controlled everything," he whispered, "from the beginning." "I controlled the risks," Catherine said, standing up. "And you, Richard, were the biggest liability on the balance sheet. I just finally wrote you off." She picked up her purse. "Goodbye, Richard. The boys will visit next month. Don't tell them how to run the ship. They're listening to the captain now." She turned and walked out. Richard watched her go. He looked down at the photo of the ship named after the woman he had underestimated for 20 years. For the first time in his life, he understood the true nature of power. It wasn't about who shouted the loudest. It was about who held the keys. Outside, the sun was shining on the upstate New York hills. A black SUV was waiting. James Blackwood stood by the open door. "How is he?" James asked as Catherine approached. "He's retired," Catherine said, slipping into the back seat. "Let's go, James. We have a meeting with the Port Authority in Singapore at 8 p.m. The Sinclair Horizon just docked there an hour early, James noted, checking his tablet as he got in the front. "Efficiency is up another 4% this quarter." "Good," Catherine said, opening her laptop. "Let's aim for 5%. The car pulled away, merging onto the highway, heading back toward the city, where the skyscrapers gleamed like needles against the sky. The Empire was safe, the storm had passed, and the quiet wife was finally, truly, at the helm. And that is how Richard Harrington lost not just his wife, but his freedom and his legacy. He learned too late that the person who supports the structure is often the one who controls it. He claimed victory because he got the title, but he didn't realize that a title is nothing without the assets to back it up. Catherine didn't win through shouting matches or public drama. She won by reading the fine print, securing her leverage, and letting her opponent's ego be his downfall. In the world of high-stakes business, the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you forgot to fear. What do you think? Did Richard deserve to go to jail, or was Catherine too ruthless in setting him up? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of corporate revenge and justice, please destroy that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and remember, Read the contract before you sign.